Ned Stark had wrestled with doubt for weeks now, pacing the confines of his command tent. A great council stood as the realm's best chance to avert bloodshed on a scale not seen since Robert's rebellion. Yet it rested on the goodwill, or at least the restrained self-interest, of people who were rarely known for restraint, especially the Lannisters. Outside King's Landing, 3 rival armies still encircled the city. Stannis Baratheon's lines fanned out along the northern roads, strict and disciplined. Renly's host spread to the south, resplendent in green and gold, with the Tyrell banners fluttering in every breeze. And the North's own men, joined by the Riverland's bannermen under Edmure Tully's command, held the westward approach, forming a siege line that pressed upon the city's gates. Within the city walls, Cersei Lannister and her son, Joffrey, clung fiercely to the Iron Throne. All the while, Gendry, the newly recognized heir by Robert's own decree, lived in a state of uneasy tension. The boy who had once hammered nails in a cramped smithy in Flea Bottom now had thousands of swords protecting him, yet he felt as vulnerable as ever. Ned believed Gendry might herald a future free of Lannister tyranny, but only if the realm could be compelled to accept him. Meanwhile, Stannis and Renly each believed the throne to be their birthright, and neither had formally relented, only paused. Their so-called truce was like a frost over a river. It could shatter at the slightest pressure. A fortnight had passed since the dramatic meeting in the Red Keep's throne room, where Cersei grudgingly agreed to consider calling a great council. For the time being, the gates remained barred, the city watch unwavering in its loyalty to Joffrey. Tensions simmered in every corner of the camps. Rumors spread that Tywin Lannister had escaped southward with a small group of knights, possibly to rally more men. Others whispered that Oberyn Martell in Dorne might intervene if the Lannisters grew too bold, or if the realm fractured further. Disparate alliances formed, unraveling just as quickly, leaving the entire kingdom braced for the first bloody blow. Ned Stark stood gazing at the walls at daybreak, the pale pink light revealing the city's sprawling rooftops. Soot clung to the air. In some parts, he could see columns of smoke curling upward, no doubt from the city's forges or the burning refuse in the poorer districts. His own thoughts drifted to Sansa and Arya. He had left them at Riverrun under guard, only bringing Gendry at the last moment so that the rightful heir, as Ned saw him, could be present should the Great Council convene. Sansa had wept at being parted from him again, but Ned feared for her safety in a camp with so many factions so close to open hostilities. Arya had argued to come along, wanting to see King's Landing once more, but Ned put his foot down firmly. It was too dangerous, and he could not risk losing her in the swirl of soldiers and intrigue. "They won't remain idle forever," came the quiet voice of Catelyn Stark, stepping up behind him. She wore a gray cloak, her hair pinned back in a modest style that belied her status as Lady of Winterfell. She, too, had arrived only recently from Riverrun with Gendry and a substantial escort, braving the uncertain roads. Ned turned to her, leaning in to speak softly. "No, they will not. Cersei is cunning. She's likely stalling to gain an advantage, time enough to gather food or to bribe some potential ally. Or perhaps she's waiting for Tywin to bring reinforcements." He rubbed his temples. "Meanwhile, we stand outside, paying to feed these armies, risking desertion or mutiny if the men believe there's no progress." Catelyn placed a hand on his arm. "The men trust your honor, Ned. They know you hold the king's decree, Robert's last will. They believe you have a just cause." "Honor may not fill a soldier's belly," Ned said grimly. Then he paused. "Any word from Stannis or Renly since the last time we spoke?" Catelyn shook her head. Some of Renly's bannermen passed messages, talking about small issues along the supply lines, but nothing more. Stannis rarely sends any messages at all. "We're drifting, Ned." They both fell silent, listening to the faint clatter from the city's walls, the occasional bark of an officer's command from the Lannister defenders. Beyond them, the city seethed with fear and suspicion. If the armies outside decided to storm the walls, the Red Keep might be well prepared to fight them off, at least for a time. But if the siege lingered, hunger and unrest would ravage the small folk. Ned had nightmares of King's Landing in flames, of the Mad King's pyromancers once again unleashing wildfire. He prayed it would not come to that. His guard captain approached, Hal Mullen, a stout man with red hair, loyal to the bone. "My lord, we have received a raven from the city. A message from the Queen Regent." Ned exchanged a look with Catelyn. "Let's see it." Hal handed over a small parchment. Ned broke the wax seal, unrolling it carefully. He read the contents once, scowling, then read them again to be sure. Catelyn eyed him anxiously. "What does it say?" Ned exhaled. "She invites us, and by us she means the leaders of these 3 armies, to come back to the Red Keep in a few days' time. She claims Joffrey has agreed to convene some manner of hearing. It is not precisely a great council, but she calls it a gathering of lords to settle the question of the throne. She states that we must come with no more than 10 men apiece, all unarmed." Catelyn's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a concession if it's true, but it could also be a trap." "Indeed." Ned's gaze flicked to the city. "Yet we cannot refuse without seeming hypocritical. We demanded a council, and now she offers a partial measure. If we reject it, we'll seem to be the aggressors. That might rally uncertain lords to her side." "We should speak to Stannis and Renly," Catelyn said. "At the very least, we must coordinate. We cannot go wandering into the Red Keep alone, unarmed, if they do not also do so." Ned folded the parchment. "Agreed. Let's go see Gendry. Then we'll ride to Stannis' camp. We can only hope they see reason." They found Gendry at the far edge of the camp, near the makeshift forge that had been set up under the direction of the northern smiths. The boy king, if king he was, had taken to hammering out spearheads and arrowheads to steady his nerves. Sweat dripped down his brow. His face was reddened by the heat of the coals. He nodded to Ned and wiped his hands on a rag. "My lord." Ned gave him a faint smile. "I see you're busy." Gendry shrugged. "I don't sleep well. Might as well do something useful." Catelyn spoke up, her tone gentle. "We may be on the verge of the meeting you've waited for. The Queen Regent has sent word that she and Joffrey will host a hearing." Gendry's eyes flicked with uncertainty. "A hearing? How does that differ from a great council?" Ned offered the parchment for him to read, though Gendry took a moment to puzzle out the words. He was not as practiced a reader as the highborn children, but he managed. A tension formed in his jaw. "They won't just have us killed if we walk in there unarmed? Isn't that what they do?" Ned sighed. "We must be cautious, but if they wanted to slaughter us outright, they could try it in more direct ways. The entire realm is watching now. An act of outright treachery with all 3 armies at the gates would be a death sentence for them. At the same time, I do not rule it out. The Lannisters have broken faith before." Gendry turned the parchment over in his hands. "Then why go?" "Because if we do not, the realm may see us as the ones refusing peaceful resolution," said Ned. "And that might give Stannis or Renly a chance to blame us for prolonging the conflict. Also, the small folk inside the city might turn even more desperate, believing the siege will never end." Gendry let out a breath, glancing at the smith's hammer in his hand. Do I go with you then?" Ned nodded. "Yes, I believe so. You are the center of Robert's will. The realm needs to see the boy named by the king. If this hearing is truly an attempt at negotiation, your presence is essential. However, you won't stand alone, Gendry. We'll have loyal men at your side. Myself, Catelyn, our chosen guards. And with luck, Stannis and Renly will each bring their retinues, ensuring the Lannisters cannot simply pick us off." Gendry's gaze fell upon the anvil. "I'm not sure I'm ready to stand in front of half the realm's lords, proclaiming that I'm the king's son. Sometimes I still don't believe it myself." "Believe it," Catelyn said quietly. "We've come too far for doubts. Remember, Robert recognized you in writing and with his seal. That has weight. And if the lords will not accept it, that is on their consciences, not yours." Gendry nodded, steeling himself. "All right, my lady. I'll do it." Ned clasped Gendry's shoulder. "Finish your shift here. We'll gather the men soon. First, I must speak with Stannis and Renly." Stannis's camp was a stark contrast to the northern lines. Where Ned's men lounged about campfires, laughing or bickering or dicing, Stannis's soldiers maintained a rigid discipline. Their tents were in neat rows, as if measured by the rod. Pikes and swords were stacked meticulously. No one dallied or gambled openly. The Red Priestess Melisandre could be glimpsed in the distance, her crimson robes a splash of color among the sober uniforms. Some men whispered that she had an unholy power, that she followed the Lord of Light and performed dark miracles, though Ned was not inclined to such superstition. Still, her presence made him uneasy. Stannis awaited Ned in a large command tent. He was conferring with several highborn knights, but upon Ned's arrival, the knights bowed and stepped aside. Stannis's jaw was firm, and his pale eyes held that hard, unyielding look Ned recalled from earlier in the war. He inclined his head in greeting. "Lord Stark." "Lord Stannis," Ned said, mindful of the precariousness of acknowledging him as anything else. "We received a message from the Queen Regent, inviting us to a hearing in the Red Keep. We plan to attend, but only if you and Lord Renly agree to do so as well. It seems we must present our claims before the city." Stannis pressed his lips into a thin line. "A hearing, another charade. She continues to deny the obvious truth, that Joffrey is illegitimate, that I am Robert's lawful heir, or, in your eyes, that your boy bastard is. Very well, I shall attend, but only if the safety of my person is guaranteed. I will bring no more than 10 men, but each will be well chosen." Ned gave a small nod. "We will do the same. We will all approach together, as a show of unity. That way, the Lannisters cannot isolate any one of us." Stannis seemed to consider, drumming his fingers on the edge of the table. A battered map of King's Landing lay before him, with troop placements sketched in charcoal. "Agreed. I will meet you at dawn, 3 days hence, at the ruined sept outside the city gates. From there we ride as one to the Red Keep. If the Lannisters have any sense, they will not risk open slaughter. But I warn you, Stark, if they do try any treachery, we will answer fire with fire." Ned inclined his head. "I understand. I pray it does not come to that." Stannis's mouth twitched, perhaps the closest thing he had to a reluctant smile. "For once, we agree." Renly's camp was a festival by comparison. Bright silken tents dotted the landscape, the sigil of House Tyrell, golden rose on green everywhere. Laughter and music drifted through the pavilions. Knights jousted for sport in impromptu tilts, and feasts stretched long into the night. Renly had always preferred splendor, and with the Tyrell alliance, he had the means to indulge. That said, behind the merriment lay tens of thousands of well-armed soldiers, a formidable force that had marched up from the Reach. Even so, Ned could not help feeling uneasy at the carefree air of it all. He remembered Robert in his prime, how Robert had also loved feasting and sport. Perhaps Renly was not so different from his older brother, except that he had never held the throne, and he had not fought in Robert's rebellion. They found Renly seated at a table laden with fruits, cheeses, and wine, wearing a short green cloak pinned with a golden stag. He looked up and beamed. "Lord Stark, to what do I owe the pleasure? Are you here for the archery contest we're holding this afternoon? I'm told we have some fine bowmen among the Tyrell ranks." Ned tried not to show his annoyance. "I'm here about the same message we all received. Cersei Lannister invites us to the Red Keep for a hearing to settle the throne." Renly gave a theatrical sigh. "And here I was hoping for a tournament in my honor. But it seems the Lannisters have grown dull indeed. Very well. We'll attend this hearing." Ned leaned forward, voice serious. "Will you ride with Stannis and me as one group? We must present a united front if we're to discourage treachery." Renly's lips quirked at the mention of Stannis. "Oh, my dear brother, he's as merry as a storm cloud. But for the sake of preventing the Lannisters from murdering us all, yes, I'll ride with you. I imagine we'll bring no more than 10 or so men. I won't be parted from Ser Loras Tyrell, though, or Brienne of Tarth, for that matter. I find her presence comforting." "Of course," Ned said curtly. "We all have that right. Just ensure your knights do not provoke Stannis's men. We need no accidents." Renly pouted in mock dismay. "Oh, you wound me, Lord Stark. I am the very soul of courtesy. Still, I must say I find this all a bit tiresome. We should simply storm the gates, oust the Lannisters, and let the realm decide. No need for these endless parleys." "If you were in the city, you might feel differently," Ned countered. "The small folk have limited food, and if forced to endure a long siege, many will starve. War is not just about banners and glory." Renly nodded, sobering somewhat. "You're right, of course. Still, I can't help but think that we're dancing around the truth. But fine, count me in." Ned thanked him curtly and left the pavilion, ignoring the stares of the Tyrell knights in their bright cloaks. He felt a flicker of relief, knowing both Baratheon brothers had agreed to attend. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a glimmer of hope for a peaceful settlement. When the appointed day came, Ned rose before dawn, going through his routine with careful deliberation. He prayed briefly in his tent, bowing his head to the old gods, though there were no weirwoods around. Then he donned a simple yet dignified attire, a dark tunic embroidered with the Stark direwolf on the chest, a cloak trimmed in the same gray. He would not wear heavy armor into the Red Keep, for the terms stated that they must come unarmed. Still, he belted on a dagger, concealed beneath the folds of his cloak, and made certain that the 10 men he chose would each do the same. The terms might forbid open arms, but Ned was no fool. If the Lannisters meant to kill them, so be it, but he would not walk into a slaughter naked. Catelyn insisted on accompanying him, as did Gendry. Hal Malin would lead the guards. Among them were men Ned trusted implicitly: Tomard, Will, and a few others who had served him since before King's Landing. They were not the mightiest knights, but each was fiercely loyal and handy with a blade if needed. They set out in the gray half-light, winding around the city walls until they neared the crumbling ruin of an old September. Stannis was already there, astride a dark horse, wearing somber riding leathers. With him stood Melisandre, her red robes stark against the dusty ruin, and a handful of men Ned recognized: Davos Seaworth, who looked uneasy, and a few bannermen from the Stormlands. Nearby, Renly trotted up with a flourish, riding a white palfrey, accompanied by Ser Loras Tyrell, resplendent in green and gold finery, and the tall, awkward figure of Brienne of Tarth, wearing a plainer surcoat with Renly's stag emblem. Her eyes flicked about warily, as though anticipating ambush. None of them greeted each other warmly, but each gave curt acknowledgments. They turned toward the city together, forming a single column. Even in that silence, the tension was palpable. At the head rode Gendry, flanked by Ned on one side and Stannis on the other. Renly trailed slightly behind, accompanied by Ser Loras. Ned could sense the swirl of uncertain glances. Did the boy truly look Baratheon enough? Some said yes. Gendry's black hair, sturdy build, and bright blue eyes mirrored a youthful Robert. Others saw only a common bastard out of his depth. Gendry stared straight ahead, jaw set, doing his best to appear composed. As they approached the towering gates of King's Landing, horns sounded from the ramparts. Guards called down, demanding to know their names and purpose. Ned raised his voice, reminding them that Queen Cersei had invited them. After a tense pause, the gates groaned open, revealing a phalanx of gold cloaks inside, lined up to escort them. Their captain rode forward, his face stiff. "Surrender your weapons, my lords. The Queen Regent commands that all must enter unarmed." Ned hesitated, exchanging a glance with Stannis and Renly. He saw Melisandre's lips curve in something like amusement, but the Red Priestess said nothing. Eventually, Ned slipped the dagger from beneath his cloak and placed it into a waiting chest that the gold cloaks offered for that purpose. One by one, the others did the same: short swords, daggers, a few hidden dirks. Ned saw that Stannis parted with his famed sword grudgingly, and that Ser Loras rolled his eyes as he dropped in a slender blade chased with gold. The gold cloaks inspected them with suspicious thoroughness before sealing the chest. "Now, if you will follow me," the captain said stiffly, "a guard detail shall accompany you to the Red Keep." They proceeded through the winding streets, passing worried clusters of small folk. The smell of waste and unwashed bodies clung to the air, more pungent than Ned remembered. The city was overcrowded, and in many places he saw closed shops, shuttered windows. Some houses had been marked with chalk symbols, perhaps signifying plague or disloyalty. People stared at the procession of high lords and knights with wide eyes, some crossing themselves in the manner of the Seven, others just scurrying away in fear. The tension in the air pressed upon them like a physical weight. The Red Keep itself loomed at the city's highest point, its red stone glinting in the sunrise. The gold cloaks led them past the gates, into the outer courtyard, and finally into the throne room, which felt colder than Ned remembered. Torches lined the walls, but they cast a flickering light that only seemed to accentuate the gloom. At the far end, on the Iron Throne, sat Joffrey Baratheon, sullen-faced and clad in black velvet with gold trim. Cersei Lannister stood beside him, wearing a gown of emerald silk. Her golden hair was piled atop her head in an artful arrangement, and her green eyes gleamed with calculation.